Picture this: a single manila folder sitting on a podium in Rome, and the moment its contents hit the air, the most fortified political empire in modern European history started shaking at its foundations. Not because of a scandal, not because of a leaked recording, not because of some backroom betrayal between rival factions, but because of something far more dangerous to powerful people who've spent years hiding in plain sight. The truth, documented, verified, in their own handwriting. On the morning of March 19th, 2026, Giorgia Meloni walked into a joint press conference with a calm that only comes from someone who has already won before the fight begins. She wasn't nervous, she wasn't performing. She had spent 4 months preparing something that no amount of institutional PR machinery, no emergency communications team, and no Brussels bureaucrat with a damage control playbook had ever prepared for. Because you can prepare for attacks, you can prepare for rumors, you can prepare for political opponents who throw punches from the outside. What you cannot prepare for is someone walking into your own house, picking up your own documents off your own shelves, and reading them back to the continent you've been governing in your own name. That's what happened. And what followed wasn't just political turbulence. What followed was the beginning of the end for Ursula von der Leyen's grip on European power. A grip that had taken 5 years to build and less than 48 hours to crack wide open. By that evening, senior European Commission officials were requesting emergency meetings. By the following morning, multiple EU member state governments were publicly echoing Meloni's exact framing. And inside the Berlaymont building in Brussels, the institution that was supposed to represent 450 million Europeans, the atmosphere had shifted from confidence to something that veteran observers hadn't seen in years. Institutional panic. The real kind. The kind that doesn't look like chaos on camera, but sounds like it behind closed doors. So what was in that folder? What did Meloni actually say? And why is it that the people running the European Union are more terrified of one Italian prime minister than they are of any court ruling, any financial collapse, or any election result on the entire continent? Stay with me, because by the time we reach the end of this, you will never look at the European Union the same way again. Before we talk about what Meloni did, we need to talk about what she was walking into, because you don't fully appreciate a demolition unless you understand the structure that's coming down. Ursula von der Leyen did not build her power at the European Commission the way most politicians build power. She didn't earn it through decades of grassroots organizing or by winning over skeptical publics with visionary ideas. She built it the way empires have always been built when they don't want anyone to notice, quietly, methodically, through institutional control rather than democratic mandate. By the time Meloni started preparing her case in late 2025, von der Leyen's second term as Commission president was already wearing the visible cracks of a regime that had promised far more than it had delivered. And I mean that in the most literal, measurable sense possible. The European Green Deal, the signature legacy project that von der Leyen had staked her entire first term on, the thing she had described as Europe's man-on-the-moon moment, had been systematically hollowed out. The 2035 ban on internal combustion engines that was supposed to be the jewel in her climate crown, riddled with exceptions. Loophole after loophole, carve-out after carve-out, until automotive industry analysts were openly pointing out that the policy bore almost no resemblance to what had originally been announced. The Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, watered down not once, not twice, but 3 separate times under sustained pressure from Germany, France, and an expanding coalition of Central and Eastern European governments who had grown tired of absorbing regulatory compliance costs that their national economies simply couldn't afford. Every major flagship initiative that von der Leyen had used to define herself as a leader had been either abandoned, gutted, or quietly reclassified as an evolving framework pending further review, which in Brussels language means it's gone, but we're not ready to announce that yet. And through all of it, von der Leyen kept appearing at press conferences with the same polished confidence, describing a Europe striding forward, a project gaining momentum, a union more cohesive than ever. The gap between her public performance and the lived reality across the continent had grown so wide that even news outlets that had reliably supported European integration were beginning to run quietly skeptical pieces about whether the Commission had any meaningful connection left to the people it claimed to serve. But the cracks in the political narrative were only part of what was fracturing. Underneath the surface, buried in the kind of financial documents that most journalists never read and most politicians never bother to understand, something far more serious was coming apart. In February 2026, the European Union's own fiscal statements for the 2025 financial year were published. Not with fanfare, not with a press conference, they were slipped into the institutional record the way governments slip things they don't want noticed. Quietly, on a Friday, alongside 14 other routine administrative announcements designed to dilute attention. Those numbers contain something extraordinary. The interest payment on the Next Generation EU Recovery Fund, the €800 billion borrowing instrument that von der Leyen had launched during the pandemic and described as Europe's finest hour, had overshot their projected cost by nearly a quarter, 23.7% above projections. In the context of an €800 billion instrument, that isn't a minor variance, that is an enormous structural problem dressed up in accounting terminology. And the money to cover that shortfall had to come from somewhere. It came from the programs that ordinary Europeans actually felt and used and depended on. Erasmus Plus, the student exchange program that has shaped an entire generation's understanding of what European identity means, took a 12% funding cut in the 2026 budget allocation. Horizon Europe, the scientific research program that was supposed to keep European universities and laboratories competitive with American and Chinese rivals, had its funding frozen pending a review that everyone in the building understood was institutional code for the money is already spoken for elsewhere. Regional development funds earmarked for infrastructure projects across southern and eastern Europe, roads, hospitals, digital connectivity in communities that had waited years for investment, were delayed indefinitely. Von der Leyen stood before the European Parliament and described all of this as responsible fiscal stewardship in a challenging global environment. Meloni watched from Rome, and she started building her case. Here is the thing about Giorgia Meloni that Brussels consistently underestimated. She is not the cartoon character that European institutional media spent years trying to make her. She is not simply a populist firebrand who shows up to press conferences with rehearsed outrage and pre-packaged attacks designed for viral clips. She is a tactician, a genuinely sophisticated political operator who understands that the most durable damage you can do to an entrenched institution is not to attack it from the outside with emotion, but to walk inside its own logic, understand it more thoroughly than it understands itself, and then use that understanding to expose what it has been hiding. She waited. She watched von der Leyen's policies collapse under their own contradictions. She watched the budget numbers quietly tell a story that the press conferences were actively contradicting. She watched trust in EU institutions across Italy fall to 31% in early 2026 polling, the lowest recorded figure since Italy joined the monetary union. And she understood something that the people inside the Parlement had stopped being able to see because they'd been inside it too long. The institution was no longer able to justify itself to the people who funded it. So she sent her team into the documents, not the leaked documents, not the confidential briefings obtained through unnamed sources, the public documents, the ones the Commission is legally required to publish. The ones that get released in 800-page technical annexes at 11 o'clock on Thursday evenings because the people who publish them are gambling that nobody with a platform and an audience will ever actually sit down and read them. Maloney's team read them, all of them, for 4 months. And what they found was not a smoking gun in the dramatic sense. What they found was something in many ways more devastating than a single scandal. They found a consistent, documented, multi-year pattern of an institution that was systematically failing the people it existed to serve, and then using its considerable communications machinery to make sure that failure never cohered into a single comprehensible narrative that the public could grasp and respond to. Until March 19th, until Rome, until Meloni stepped up to that microphone. The first document Meloni surfaced was the European Commission's own Annual Management and Performance Report for 2025. This is a document that receives the kind of media coverage usually reserved for municipal zoning amendments. Zero. It exists. It gets filed. It sits in the public record, accessible to anyone, read by almost nobody who matters. On page 247 of that report, buried under layers of administrative language calibrated to exhaust rather than inform the reader, was an admission. The Commission's own auditors had found that 34% of cohesion fund expenditures reviewed during the 2025 audit cycle contained irregularities serious enough to trigger repayment demands from member states. Let me put that in human terms, because the bureaucratic language is specifically designed to prevent you from feeling the weight of what that number means. Cohesion funds are the most tangible proof that being part of the European Union delivers something real to real people. They are the bridges being built in rural Romania. They are the broadband networks reaching villages in southern Italy that would otherwise be left behind by the digital economy. They are the hospitals, the schools, the infrastructure investments that transform abstract membership in a continental project into something a farmer or a factory worker or a school teacher can actually point to and say, this is what Europe did for my community. When 34% of that spending is flagged for irregularities, it means that billions of euros intended for those communities went somewhere else. It means the bridges didn't get built, or the contracts went to the wrong places, or the administrative procedures were so poorly designed that the money never made it past the machinery designed to distribute it. Meloni looked into the cameras and asked a question. A simple, clean, devastating question. If the institution cannot manage the funds it distributes to its most vulnerable member regions without a 34% error rate, on what moral or institutional basis does it claim the authority to lecture democratically elected national governments about fiscal discipline? There was no clean answer to that question. There still isn't. The second document was, if anything, worse. In December 2025, the European Court of Auditors published a special report on the Just Transition Fund. This was the 17.5 billion euro mechanism von der Leyen had created to support communities across Europe whose economic foundations were being deliberately dismantled by EU climate policy. Coal towns in Silesia, steel communities in the Ruhr Valley, energy workers across southeastern Europe whose entire professional identity was tied to industries that Brussels was actively making illegal. Von der Leyen had promised these communities that the transition would be managed, that there would be a safety net, that Europe would not simply eliminate their livelihoods and then abandon them to figure out the rest on their own. The Court of Auditors found that 3 years into the fund's operation, 11% of its allocated resources had actually reached the communities it was designed to serve. 11%. The remaining 89% of 17.5 billion euros was still moving through a maze of administrative eligibility reviews, compliance certification processes, multi-layer approval procedures, and bureaucratic qualification mechanisms so labyrinthine that regional governments with limited administrative staff simply could not navigate them successfully. The communities were still waiting, the industries were already gone, the money was orbiting inside an administrative system that appeared to exist primarily to perpetuate its own processes, rather than accomplish the human outcomes those processes were supposedly designed to deliver. Meloni presented all of this not with theatrical rage or the chest-thumping populism that Brussels had spent years preparing its defenses against. She presented it the way a surgeon presents a diagnosis, precisely, clinically, with the steady composure of someone who is not performing anger because they don't need to. The documents were generating the emotion on their own. And then she said the sentence that completed the architecture of her case. She said that when an institution's own auditors, using the institution's own methodologies, consistently document that it cannot deliver on its foundational commitments to its most vulnerable beneficiaries, that institution does not have a management problem. It has a legitimacy problem. And legitimacy, once genuinely lost in the eyes of the people an institution claims to represent, cannot be recovered through restructuring announcements, transparency initiatives, or the creation of new oversight committees. It can only be recovered through real accountability. And real accountability, she said, is the one thing the European Commission under Ursula von der Leyen has never once accepted in 6 consecutive years of operation. The communications teams in Brussels had started drafting response documents before she even finished speaking. But the people in that building who had been in European politics long enough to understand what had just happened weren't working on responses. They were doing something else. They were looking at each other and doing the arithmetic on how bad this was going to get. In crisis communications, there is a principle that even first-year practitioners understand. When you are caught with your own data, do not pretend the data doesn't exist. Do not issue a response that conspicuously avoids every specific figure your opponent cited. Do not write 1,400 words that mention commitment to transparency 11 times without once engaging with the actual substance of the critique. Brussels issued exactly that response within 48 hours. 1,400 words, zero engagement with any specific number Meloni had cited. The phrases institutional reform, ongoing improvement processes, and commitment to transparency appeared a combined 17 times. Political journalists across Europe counted. Several of them wrote pieces about the counting. The response became its own story, and that story was worse than the original crisis. Because when an institution is accused of systemic opacity and responds to that accusation with an opaque non-answer, it isn't defending itself. It's confirming the charge. Media outlets that had spent years broadly sympathetic to the European project, publications that had reliably pushed back against Eurosceptic narratives and defended Brussels integration against nationalist criticism, began running editorials questioning whether the Commission retained any meaningful capacity for institutional self-awareness. The deflection had converted a political crisis into something closer to a credibility collapse, and the ground underneath that collapse was still moving. Because Meloni had not yet played her final card. Everything we've discussed so far, the budget failures, the audit irregularities, the broken promises to vulnerable communities, all of that was damaging. Genuinely, seriously damaging. But it was also the kind of damage that institutions survive. Governments fail at implementation all the time, funds get mismanaged, auditors find irregularities, The institutional response is to announce reforms, appoint task forces, publish updated procedures, and wait for the news cycle to move on. What Meloni put on the table next was categorically different, because it wasn't about how the Commission had failed to execute its responsibilities. It was about how it had systematically redesigned its relationship to democratic accountability to ensure that nobody with actual democratic authority could hold it responsible for anything. Between 2020 and 2025, the European Commission, under von der Leyen's direct leadership, issued 1,847 delegated acts and implementing acts. These are legal instruments that allow the Commission to make binding regulatory decisions, rules that directly govern how Europeans heat their homes, what their agricultural practices must look like, what their businesses are required to disclose, how their vehicles must be built, what their buildings must achieve in terms of energy efficiency, without requiring those decisions to pass through the European Parliament as ordinary legislation. Delegated acts exist for a legitimate purpose. Complex regulatory systems require technical implementation decisions that don't warrant full legislative processes for every adjustment. Nobody is arguing that the European Commission should need a parliamentary vote every time it updates a technical standard, but 1,847 decisions affecting hundreds of millions of people over 5 years is not technical implementation. That is governance. That is the exercise of genuine political power over the lives of real human beings. The European Parliament formally objected to 11 of them, not because the other 1,836 were genuinely uncontroversial, because the parliamentary majority that von der Leyen's political coalition controlled was structured in a way that consistently prevented objections from reaching the floor. Meloni named what this was. She didn't call it mismanagement, she didn't call it overreach, she called it what it actually represented when you trace its full implications. She called it the quiet coup, not tanks, not emergency decrees, not the dramatic, visible seizure of power that people associate with democratic backsliding because they've been trained to only recognize its most theatrical forms. A slow, procedural, technically legal suffocation of democratic accountability, conducted entirely in the language of treaty compliance and institutional process, one delegated act at a time, over 5 years, while the European Parliament watched, while the member state governments complained in private and capitulated in public, and while 450 million Europeans went about their lives entirely unaware that the volume of unelected power being exercised over those lives had been quietly turned up to a level the European project had never previously reached. This is what Meloni meant when she said that the democratic deficit in European governance was not an accident or a drift or an unintended consequence of institutional complexity. It was a design choice, made deliberately, sustained consistently, by one person who understood how to use the machinery of European governance to concentrate authority in ways that no treaty reform, no election result, and no political opposition had ever managed to prevent. The silence from Brussels that followed this portion of Meloni's statement was not the silence of an institution preparing a careful response. It was the silence of an institution that had just watched the last available defense come down. The European Union has faced Eurosceptic criticism for as long as it has existed. Nigel Farage spent years at that same European Parliament microphone, delivering blistering attacks on Brussels bureaucracy. Viktor Orban has been waging an institutional war against Commission authority for over a decade. Marine Le Pen built her entire political identity around the idea that the EU had betrayed French sovereignty. None of them broke through. None of them converted institutional criticism into genuine institutional crisis. Why? Because they attacked from outside the frame. They positioned themselves as opponents of the European project itself, which allowed Brussels to respond not to their specific arguments, but to their identity. You can dismiss a Eurosceptic's critique of the Commission by pointing to their Euroscepticism. The critique becomes evidence of an agenda rather than a legitimate observation. Meloni did something fundamentally different. She did not attack the European project. She defended it. She argued that the European Union's core promise, the thing that gives it its claim on the loyalty and taxes and democratic consent of its member populations, is that it delivers better collective outcomes than individual nations could achieve alone. She argued that this promise is worth protecting, that the European project is worth fighting for. And then she argued that Ursula von der Leyen's Commission had become the single greatest threat to that project's survival, not because of ideology, not because of nationalism, because of a documented, evidenced, audited failure to deliver on the institution's own stated commitments to the people it exists to serve, combined with a systematic restructuring of accountability mechanisms designed to ensure that this failure could never be effectively challenged from within. That argument cannot be dismissed by pointing to Meloni's political identity. It cannot be deflected by calling it populism. It cannot be survived by announcing a new transparency initiative and waiting for the news cycle to move on, because it is built entirely from the institution's own record, its own numbers, its own auditors' findings, its own documented pattern of procedural control. You cannot counter an argument built from your own evidence without either engaging with that evidence or confirming that you have no credible engagement to offer. Von der Leyen's team chose not to engage with the evidence, and in doing so, they confirmed everything Meloni had argued. Here is where we land. Ursula von der Leyen's political position is not what it was on March 18th. Something shifted on March 19th that cannot be unshifted. It isn't that a scandal broke. It isn't that a crime was alleged. It isn't that a political opponent landed a particularly effective rhetorical punch. It's that the foundational story the Commission tells about itself, that it is a competent, accountable, democratically legitimate institution working in the interests of European citizens, was publicly examined against the institution's own documented record and found to be insufficient. And this happened in a way that leaves no available counter-narrative. You cannot say the documents are wrong. You cannot say the auditors are biased. You cannot say Meloni invented the figures. The figures are Brussels figures. The audit findings are Brussels audit findings. The delegated act count is a matter of public treaty record. What happens next matters enormously. Not just for European politics, not just for the question of who leads the Commission in 2030, but for the more fundamental question of whether democratic accountability can still function as a genuine constraint on concentrated institutional power in a system that has spent 15 years engineering itself to minimize the friction of accountability. Meloni's press conference did not answer that question, but it asked it in a way that cannot now be unasked. The folder is open, the numbers are in the air, the continent is watching. And for the first time in a very long time, the people running the most powerful institution in Europe are the ones who look like they don't know what comes next. That is not a small thing. That is, in the language of institutional history, a turning point. The only question left is whether Europe's political culture has the courage to turn.